really like the Song of the Month thing that we're doing. That's a good one we just sang. Some of them are hard to get down, but when we learn that one a little better and you can think about the words more instead of trying to make sure you get everything in where it's supposed to be, that's got some good stuff in it. And some of those songs, if Lance wasn't making us do this, we'd never sing them, right? You'd take one look at it and go, I don't know that one, and we'd skip on over it. But I'm glad that we're doing that, stretching our musical vocabulary. You're going to be sitting somewhere someday and somebody's going to be singing a song and you're going to go, oh, I know that one. Everybody else is going to be looking around going, I don't think I've ever heard that song before. And you'll say, thank you, Lance. Hebrews chapter 11. We have been going through this faith chapter and looking at these incredible folks that are mentioned here. And we started last week dealing with what I've been calling the patient patriarchs, waiting faith, in verses 8 down through verse 22. And we dealt with Abraham and the ingredients of a faith-filled life. And tonight we're going to look at the following generations that experienced to a certain degree much the same thing that he did. And it's interesting the way in which God chooses to share what he wants us to know about these individuals. So starting in verse 20, we'll read down through verse 22. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. And by faith, Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, in this chapter, you have challenged us a great deal about our daily living in our faith. And tonight, as we look at these three individuals, much could be said about their lives, but what you actually choose to tell us is that they died in faith. Faith is worth dying for, as we're going to see over and over again throughout the rest of the chapter. There are a lot of things that the world tells us are valuable, but a lot of things that most folks would not consider dying for. And the end of a well-lived life is summed up by the way in which they passed from this earth, still believing, fully convinced in their own minds and living their life accordingly, that what you told them would come to pass. And I trust that we would live our life in the same way. In Jesus' name, amen. Three gentlemen here to finish out the patriarchs, and we start with Isaac. What's interesting about all three of these men, you could say quite a bit about them, but they are described as having great faith at the end of their life about to die. And some of them had long bouts, and we're not going to go into great detail, but we'll look a little bit at it. They struggled with their faith, maybe with the exception of Joseph. But if I were writing this, and probably if you were writing this, and you were going to point to some great moment of faith in Joseph's life, you would probably go to the point when he is going to stand up for God, and he gets in trouble, and Potiphar has him cast into prison. Or you'd think about how faithful he is in prison, and God uses him to reveal dreams, and we're waiting for the time when God is going to deliver him out of the prison, and we wait for the climax of the story when the great things are about to happen, and yet Joseph is still stuck in there for 2 more years. And then you think about being brought before Pharaoh and having the guts to interpret more dreams, even though it's not really a favorable outcome. Everybody loves to hear the 7 years of plenty, but we don't like the 7 years of famine part of the stories, right? I mean, bring on the blessing, but who wants the trials and the tough times? Or maybe we would talk about how he had such character that during those testing times when the family shows up and they are in dire need of food, instead of arresting them or torturing them in some way, while he tests their faith, we see a very loving and forgiving individual. And we could share all of those things. But that's not what God brings out as the statement in all three of these individuals for why they made it into Hebrews chapter 11. Now remember the original audience that this book is being written to. You have Jews who are going through some tough times, and they're thinking about forsaking and going back to the Jewish faith and not to the Christian faith. And so if you are going to persuade a Jewish person that it is worth it to stick it out through the toughest of times, right here in the middle of this chapter is the meat. Because you're going to talk about Father Abraham, you're going to talk about Isaac, you're going to talk about Jacob, and you're going to talk about Joseph. And these folks, if they can be shown to the nation of Israel, listen, this guy had 12 sons, and they are the 12 tribes of Israel, and he lived his life by faith, then you have a convincing argument. They didn't always live by faith, and God was working in their lives, and that's one of the things that I like about these individuals that are mentioned here. Because when you go back to Genesis and you start reading the account, sometimes you look at them and you think, man, these fellows were a train wreck. How in the world did they make it into Hebrews chapter 11? Faith sustained them then, and they passed it on to the next generation. And that's what you have to understand. Listen, faith isn't a genetic trait that you can automatically pass on to your kids. My kids are going to be born with such and such a hair and probably be somewhat tall and probably be. And oh, by the way, they're going to be very faithful because their mom and dad were. I wish it worked like that, don't you? But that's not how it works. However, one of the things that we do learn from this situation is when they see faith in action, even the failings of it and the tough times that are fleshed out by these three men, you see that it is something that they carried from generation to generation to generation. Isaac lived the longest of all the patriarchs. And yet, there are only 2.5 chapters about his life. About half of chapter 25 in Genesis, chapter 26 and 27. By contrast, Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph each get about 12 full chapters. So if you think about it, I mean, there is an enormous amount of information about Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph, and there's very little about Isaac. In fact, nothing spectacular because he lived a quiet and an ordinary life with some major downfalls. And what's so interesting about that is when you have a man like Abraham who did the things that he did by faith and then was asked later in life to sacrifice his son, you have to remember who was there on the 3-day journey. You have to remember who's asking the questions as they're getting ready to head up the mountain. You have to understand the willingness and the humility and the obedience of a young man who probably very easily could have outrun or fought off his dad, and yet he allowed him to be bound, put on the altar, didn't say a word when the knife was getting ready to come down. That has to make a fantastic impact on an individual. And so when we get to Hebrews chapter 11, you'd be thinking, well, you have this dynamic man, Abraham. Certainly he's going to pass on this dynamic faith to Isaac, and Isaac is just going to move mountains and change people. But one of the things that we learn about Hebrews chapter 11 is that God doesn't always work that way. I do want you to turn to Genesis chapter 26 and look at verses 3 and 4, because this important statement shows up and it's going to get passed from generation to generation. In Genesis chapter 26 and verses 3 and 4, this promise is going to be renewed to him by God. Now we know that God showed up to Abraham several times and gave him the promise. But what about to Isaac? Genesis 26, 3 and 4, it says, "Sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee, and will bless thee. For unto thee and unto thy seed I will give all these countries. And I will perform the oath which I swear unto Abraham thy father. And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed." Now, what we didn't read is verse 1. Because oftentimes when God showed up and encouraged and re-spoke the promise to Abraham is when Abraham was having a tough time and he was really kind of getting drugged down. In verse 1 it says, "There was a famine in the land beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham, and Isaac went unto Abimelech, king of the Philistines, unto Gerar." Now, right as he is being challenged himself, and Dad isn't here to lead anymore, so it's his responsibility, and God is going to bring a test into his life. He brings a severe famine. Abraham had to deal with it. How did Dad deal with it? Well, Isaac is going to pack up, and he is going to go unto Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, and look for help there. And the problem is, while he is there, he is going to lie about Rebekah, and he's going to do what Dad said, and she's my sister and not my wife. And we have the whole situation happened with Abraham, and now it is happening with Isaac as well. But God reiterates to him the threefold promise. If you're Isaac, and you know that God told your dad over and over and over again that his seed was going to be multiplied like the stars in heaven and like the sand on the seashore, and yet there was only one of you, would you still take God at his word in faith? And one of the things that we're going to see is God's going to come to Isaac and he's going to give him the exact same threefold promise. "Listen, Isaac, your dad was faithful to me, and in you I am going to bring forth this promise, and your seed is going to be like, and your seed is going to be like." And when we get to the end of Isaac's life, how many children does he have? See, sometimes the testing of the faith shows up in that way. Am I fully convinced in my mind that God is going to do exactly what he says he's going to do, even when it didn't seem like it with Abraham, because I'm the only one standing here? And then you're going to have Isaac, who is all in, and at the end of his life, he's going to say, "Listen, God's going to do what he said he's going to do," but Isaac only has two, right? Jacob and Esau. And it isn't until you get to Jacob that you're going to start to actually see multiplying going on. We're 3 generations in and we're up to 12. It doesn't sound like the stars of heaven and the sand of the seashore. And so practically speaking, it would be easy to get to the end of your life and say, well, it didn't happen in Dad's generation, and now it's not happening in my generation. But that's the whole point here of the verse in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 20. God is going to repeat the promise to him again down in verse 24. "And the Lord appeared unto him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham thy father. Fear not, for I am with thee, and I will bless thee and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake." And his response in verse 25, "And he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants digged a well." Why? Well, he digged a well because he was planning on being there for a while, and you got to have water. See, his actions indicated that he took God at his word. Are they going to live permanently in the promised land? And is it going to be theirs yet? No. But that doesn't make a difference. When Abraham sojourned, he digged wells as if he was going to live there. And his son is going to worship, and he's going to act upon the word that God gave him, and he's going to live like that. See, this blessing has been passed on. And what's interesting here, turn to chapter 25, if you will, verses 21 through 24. because you're familiar with how the blessing is passed on. Isaac is getting old, and he can't see very well, and he knows the time of his death is near, and he has two boys. He favors the older one, Esau, probably because... What's that?
Genesis?
Yes, Genesis. Probably because Esau is the one who goes out and hunts and makes food for him. And he gets to smell like the meadows and like the forests, and Isaac doesn't get to experience any of that anymore. And then we have Jacob, who is the quieter, gentler one, who tends to dwell in tents. He spends a lot of time around mom and is the favorite of mom, while Esau is the favorite of dad. And so when it comes time to bless them, God chose the younger one, Jacob. And it happened all the way back when the boys were born, right? And so it should have been something that they paid attention to and realized. Look at Genesis chapter 25, verses 21 through 24. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. Okay? Hold the phone. One of the greatest love stories in the Bible is Isaac and Rebekah, right? But does the promise from God say you are going to have a wonderful romantic love story? It says you're going to have what? Kids. And the verse right before it says Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife. And apparently they tried for a while and didn't have any kids. And so when you're practically looking at this from a faith standpoint, God, you told me that I was going to have kids, but I'm begging you because my wife is barren. Listen, didn't his dad have to go through that for a long time? Yeah, because he was 100 years old before he had Isaac. And now we see Isaac being tested in similar fashion. We're not told that it is a long period of time, but it is a test. Okay? She is pregnant. Verse 22. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it be so, why am I thus?" And she went to inquire of the Lord. Obviously, ladies, if you have had young ones, you have been thrilled to have them kick and move around. Oh, I can feel my little cherubim. Apparently, this was a whole lot more than feeling a baby kick. This was like full-on fighting in the womb. And I'm just going to imagine it wasn't the least bit comfortable because she said, "What in the world's going on? What's happening here?" Listen, and the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. Now, if you can't figure out that there's turmoil coming from that verse, there's something wrong. You have 2 babies who are struggling in the womb. And he doesn't say, together these 2 are going to become a great nation. What does he say? You are going to have 2 great nations. Now the promise is that you're going to have seed like the stars of the heaven and the sand, and it's going to be this chosen nation that I'm going to work through. Well, which one are you going to choose then if I'm going to have 2 great nations, right? It's set up that there's going to be conflict, and you're going to see it all the way through Jacob and Esau's life. God chooses the younger. This is contrary to everything that was done at that point in time. The firstborn son was the chosen one. He's the one that inherited everything. He was the favored one. He was the one given the blessing. And then it became his responsibility to take care of the rest of the family. But that's not the case here. God let them know that he was choosing the younger one. And then we have Isaac wanting to bless Esau when he is getting ready to die. And God is working despite all the deceitfulness. You cannot read that account without thinking, these 4 people are scoundrels. Where's the character? This guy wants to bless the firstborn, despite the fact that their whole life God told them, I am going to work through Jacob. Jacob is favoring this one's favoring this one goes out to hunt. He's mad at this one because he stole his birthright. Now, mom's trying to get this one to go in here and deceive dad, and dad blesses him. But the problem here is, go to chapter 27 of Genesis. Understanding is going to settle in Jacob's mind when he gets here to the end of his life and he is going to bless his son. Look at verse 33. Isaac trembled very exceedingly and said, Who? Where is he that hath taken venison and brought it to me? And I have eaten of all before you camest and have blessed him. Last phrase is important. Yea, and he, what? Why? Because God said it was going to happen. And when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with a great exceeding bitter cry, and he said unto his father, Bless me, even me also, O my father. Jump down to verse 37. And Isaac answered and said unto Esau, Behold, I have made him thy lord, and all his brethren have I given to him for servants, and with corn and wine have I sustained him. And what shall I do now unto thee, my son? What he realizes is the permanence of God's blessing was given to Jacob because God chose Jacob. He said way back before the boys were born that that's what's going to happen. And he didn't realize how everything was going to unfold and how messy life was going to get in between. But he gets to the end and he thinks he's doing one thing, and he finds out that he's actually doing exactly what God wanted him to do through all the deceitfulness. And so when Esau comes in, he said, you know what? This is going to be accomplished. And actually, if he could paraphrase, he'd probably say, because it already is accomplished. God worked despite me. And I know he is going to always accomplish that which he has promised. Well, then we get to Jacob. Jacob in verse 21, it says, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped upon the top of his staff. Is that all we have to say about Jacob? A life of learning to live by faith in God. Jacob is an interesting character. We're not going to turn to these and look at all of them, but in chapter 28, verses 20 through 22, he bargains with God. Listen, God, if you're going to take care of me, then I promise you, vow is the word, biblical word, I vow that I'm going to worship you and be faithful to you all the days of my life. And that comes because in verses 16 and 17, he has this dream of a ladder and how God is going to work in his life. He wrestled with him in chapter 32, verses 24 through 26. And he would not let him go until he blessed him, and he had to touch the sinew in his hip and wither it before he could get Jacob to let go. And so we have this wrestling individual who at times is depending upon God, and at other times he is wrestling with him and fighting him and trying to figure it all out. But right after he wrestled with him, in verse 28, God changed his name because Jacob means a supplanter. And he starts calling him Israel, which means prince or ruler. See, Jacob, I am working in your heart and life to get you to realize that you're not always supposed to be the supplanter. I promised a promise to your grandfather, and I promised a promise to your father, and I promised a promise to you, and I want you to see that I'm going to live up to that. And he has 12 sons that become the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. But in Genesis chapter 48, verses 3 through 5, he is getting ready to, well, he has a whole chapter where he blesses his sons, and some of it's interesting. But in chapter 48, verses 3 through 5, he is blessing Joseph. Is Joseph the oldest? It's interesting, isn't it? And Joseph is actually way down the line. And yet God chose Joseph to work in, and so Jacob realizes it, and he's going to bless Joseph. But not only is he going to bless Joseph, he is so thankful to God that he gets to see Joseph again when he never thought he would. And he actually says, I never thought I would see you, and here I get to see your children. It's a statement, a testimony to the fact that God is good. He's going to bless Ephraim and Manasseh. Let me ask you a question. Which one is the oldest? Manasseh's the oldest. But we always say Ephraim and Manasseh because that's what God said. In thee I will bless Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, here's the thing. Jacob, who is now Israel, is getting ready to pass away. And after he blesses Joseph, he asks Joseph to bring his 2 sons to him. And he can't see very well, and he's getting really old. And so Joseph guides Manasseh, the firstborn, to his right hand, and Ephraim to his left hand. And Jacob gets ready to bless him and goes, and Joseph is on his knees with his head bowed before his father, and Jacob starts blessing him, and he realizes, wait a second, and he tries to move his dad's right hand to the oldest ones, and he said, not so. God has said. Has this ever happened before? It's almost a family trait, right? It's a pattern. He did it with me. I did it with you, Joseph. Why are you so surprised when God's choosing the younger? Ephraim is going to be much more than Manasseh is. So we get to Joseph in verse 22. And what's interesting about Joseph, he didn't use the family trouble. He didn't use the job struggles or successes because he had a lot of both. And he didn't use the influence of Egypt as an excuse. Turn, if you will, real quickly to Genesis chapter 50. I know we're fast forwarding, but unless you want to be here all night long, we got to hurry. Genesis chapter 50, verses 22 through 26. And Joseph dwelled in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. Okay? Is he living in a state of success, worldly speaking? Yeah, he's third in command of all of Egypt. Right? A very powerful individual, very successful man. But is he in the promised land? And is there a multitude of people? And has all of the nations of the world been blessed through Abraham? No, not yet. Keep going. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. You see, God is starting to reward the faith of the individuals involved. Abraham, 1. To Isaac, 1. To Jacob and Esau, 2. From Jacob, or Israel, we have 12. And now one of the 12, while he is growing close to the end of his life, he is looking out and thinking about the promises that God has made, and there goes his grandbaby. And there goes his great-grandbaby and his great-grandbaby, because he got to see Ephraim's grandchildren's children before he passed away. And he got to see Manasseh's grandchildren before he passed away. And so you're starting to see the expansion happen. And while it's not great yet, these folks that have lived their entire life depending on the promise of God are starting to see little parts where he is encouraging them with what he is about to do. In verses 24 and 25, Joseph said unto his brethren, I die. Now here's faith. And God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. He knew what he believed, and he knew where he belonged. He said, listen, don't you leave me down here in Egypt. When we go back to the promised land, you take my bones with me, and I want to be buried in the inheritance with everybody else. It's what they did for his dad when his dad passed away, right? Israel made him promise, and so they took a big long thing and they buried him in the promised land. Now, look at verse 26. So Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Why the last two phrases? Well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, I'll tell you what it has to do. Embalming. Many folks were embalmed, but most folks, if they were embalmed, were buried in swathing. And oftentimes they had burial chambers, and they'd slide a body in there, and then when somebody else died, they'd slide another one in there, and they'd slide another one in there, so that if you went down into a burial chamber, they would have little niches cut in the rock. And if you want to know who had died first, you'd have to go to the back. I mean, there might be 4, 5, 6 bodies laid on their side, wrapped in cloth, and pushed back against there. Sometimes they were put in a tomb, but rarely ever in a coffin, as we'll see in a minute. Embalming took time, and it took money. Experienced folks had to do it. So not just everyone did it, and certainly not slaves, which the nation of Israel is going to become. They're not yet. And then it says he's put in a coffin. This was reserved for people of distinction. And the size of the coffin and what it was made of and how much it cost was the distinction about how they were honored. Why does it say all this? Because the world is honoring this individual with a great funeral. And Joseph says, I don't know when you're leaving here, but I know you're leaving here because God said you are. So take my bones with you when the promise happens. In Exodus chapter 13, verse 19, they go and they dig up Joseph's bones on the night preceding getting ready to leave. And they pack all their stuff and they head out of there, and they haul Joseph's bones with them. And they're getting ready to cross the river, and they refuse to cross the river, so guess what they have to do for 40 years? They're hauling Joseph's bones all over the wilderness. In fact, it's not until Joshua chapter 24 and verse 32 that it says, and the children of Joseph. How many generations removed do you think that is, folks? We are talking 440 years, at least, plus conquering the promised land. But 400 and let's say 50 years later, and how many generations later, they finally do what Joseph asked them to do in faith all that long time ago. Because when God said it, he is going to accomplish it. And it was passed down from generation to generation to generation. And they were so convinced of it that even though they had a lot of trials and trouble in their own life, they never gave up on the fact that what God promised, he eventually, at some point, was going to accomplish. Has he accomplished those 3 promises to the nation of Israel? Yes, he has. Which brings us to our communion table. Because he asks us to observe the communion table in remembrance of me, what? Until he comes. How many generations have passed since he said that? How many folks have been looking day after day for the return of Jesus Christ and he hasn't come? Does that mean that he's not a man of his word and he's not coming back? Absolutely not. The whole point of Hebrews chapter 11. It may take a lot longer than we think it ought to, but when God says it, it's going to happen. So turn with me, if you will, to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Starting in verse 23. For I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup when he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye as oft as ye drink it in remembrance of me. For as oft as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, ye do show the Lord's death till he come. Wherefore whosoever shall eat this bread and drink this cup of the Lord unworthily shall be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. For he that eateth and drinketh unworthily eateth and drinketh damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. For if we should judge ourselves, we should not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened of the Lord, that we should not be condemned with the world. Wherefore, my brethren, when ye come together to eat, tarry one for another. And if any man hunger, let him eat at home, that ye come not together unto condemnation. And the rest will I set in order when I come.